Welcome to Trash Compactor. I'm Josh. In our continuing coverage of the Star Wars prequels, we finally arrived at Episode 3, and who can forget the famous opening duel between Anakin Skywalker and Obi-Wan Kenobi at the beginning of the movie on the lava world of Sigma Volcanus, locked in mortal combat over who will possess the ultimate power bestowed by the Kyber crystal. No? You didn't see that in the Episode 3 you saw? Well, I happen to be holding the script to Star Wars 3 Fall of the Republic right here, and it says here, oh, written by John L. Flynn. Who's John L. Flynn? Well, I'm glad you asked, because today's guest is the author of the infamous fan treatment for the final of the Star Wars prequels written in the early 1980s, and to this day has been mistaken for the real thing. It's actually true. I was doing some research for this, and I saw on a message board someone still thought it was a real Lucasfilm document, and the timestamp was 2022. So it's still fooling people. Um, I'm fairly certain that I encountered this document first for sale at a dealer's table at a Star Trek convention in the early 1990s, and it's held sway over me ever since as a window into what the mysterious dark times before the original Star Wars movies might have been like. And for that reason, I'm very pleased to welcome its author, Mr. John L. Flynn, to Trash Compactor. Mr. Flynn, thank you very much for joining me today.
Oh, thank you very much for having me. And it's actually Doctor.
Oh, it's actually Doctor. Excuse me. Welcome, Dr. Flynn, to Trash Compactor.
Oh, that's all right. Happy to be here.
First things first, I was wondering if you could clear something up for me. So I'm holding in my hands a copy of Star Wars 3 Fall of the Republic, story treatment by John L. Flynn, with a red cover. I think this may be a copy that I acquired at the aforementioned Star Trek convention, but it says here, first edition, January 20, 1982, but the pages inside say September 6, 1983. So I'm wondering if you could clear up for me, when did you actually write this?
I wrote that for Christmas 1982.
Oh,
So
okay.
I was um, at the time working a minimum wage job, and I wanted to be able to buy my friends Christmas gifts for the upcoming holiday. And I honestly couldn't afford to do that. And so one of my friends said, why don't you write them a story and give that as a gift for the holidays? And well, they said, well, what kind of story should you be writing? And so somebody suggested, why don't you write a Star Wars story? And so I wrote the treatment that you have right there. We all thought that the next trilogy would follow our middle trilogy, and that we had been told that Lucas was going to tell the story in reverse. So episode 3 would be before episode 2 and episode 1.
Oh, I
And
see.
so that is the reason why I did my treatment for the third film in the series, thinking that that would have been the first one that we would have seen. And so I literally wrote that for about a dozen of my friends. I bound it in the way that you have it there. In fact, it looks like it could be an original. And I had the cover printed. It was a modest production, again, just for my friends at Christmas. So one of my friends was a wheeler dealer at the conventions. And
Huh.
what I didn't know they were going to do was they were going to mark that up and sell that at the conventions as the actual treatment for the next Star Wars film. And, it's kind of flattering if you think about it, but I never made a dime on this. This was, in fact, I probably lost money printing this up and giving it out to my friends as a Christmas gift that year. And this guy reproduced hundreds, maybe thousands of these, and these went out all over the conventions. And that's kind of the story of where that came from. I the next Christmas I wrote a treatment for one of the Star Trek films and gave that as a gift. And I think it was called The Trial of James T. Kirk, and this was supposed to be before the voyage home.
Ri You know what? That's actually lighting up some neurons that haven't fired in quite a long time. That rings a bell, The Trial of James T. Kirk. I'm gonna have to go and dig that up because now I'm curious to read it. But that's quite a story, actually. I think today they would probably term that going viral, right?
Well, yes, that would be exactly it. And again, it was kind of flattering, but I didn't know that this guy was going to make a lot of money from it. And you know what? I would go by, I would surf by his table because I did a lot of conventions back then. I did maybe 12 a year. And I would surf by his table and I'd kind of listen to him. And he would be telling people, oh, yeah, this is coming from Lucasfilm itself. And this is going to be the next movie. And oh my God.
Wow, that's really yeah, so that actually fills in a lot of the puzzle pieces for me because I was always wondering how this sort of acquired the urban legend status that it did, and it seems I mean, not on your part certainly, but it seems that some of that was intentional showmanship, which is fascinating. I didn't know that.
Would you believe before I finalize that, there's a science fiction writer by the name of Alan Wold, Wold. And at the time, I was aspiring to become a science fiction writer. I've achieved that now, but I showed that to Alan, and Alan worked through the document and made all of the corrections for me. And he says, I believe it, but, I'm sure they're going to come up with something even more bizarre than that for the film. And alas, that's what we had. That was something pretty bizarre.
Yeah, well, why don't we jump right to that because I reread it in preparation to speak with you. I hadn't read it probably since the early 1990s, and I was actually struck how many things in here kind of echoed things that ended up in the actual episode 3 that George Lucas made. Episode 3 Revenge of the Sith came out in 2005, so 20ish years he wrote his after you wrote yours. There were things like the idea that the death of Anakin's wife has something to do with his final fall to the dark side. There's a montage scene in your treatment of the fall of the Jedi as they make their last stand.
Yeah.
The end sequence is very similar with the various characters where they end up sort of setting the table for episode 4, the original Star Wars. And I was just wondering, I'm curious if you wonder because I certainly did. Do you think George Lucas ever read your treatment?
Well, this is interesting. A few years ago, and I'm thinking maybe 10 years ago, Lucas was publishing a magazine. Do they still publish their magazine? I don't recall.
The Star Wars magazine?
Yes,
The Star Wars Insider is the official
that's
Star Wars magazine. Yeah. So yeah,
yes,
they still
that's
publish
it.
it. Yeah.
There was a person working at Lucasfilm, and he had a copy of my treatment. And he said, I'd like to do an interview with you for the magazine. And I said, that would be very, very nice. And he says, you talk about a lot of things that ended up going into the final film. And I have my doubts as to whether George read your script or, maybe had somebody read it and, give him a rundown on what you had put together. So we were all set to do this interview, sort of like what you and I are doing today. And at the last minute, George canceled the interview. And he said to
Interesting.
the guy, and I wish I could remember his name, but he was somebody who actually worked in Lucasfilm and he was part of the magazine. And he said, John, I'm sorry, we're going to have to can this because this is a little bit too touchy for the magazine here. And I said, okay, and I was disappointed. And he says, tell you what, I'm going to send you a couple of our official t-shirts that we have around the office. And they did that. And afterwards, I kept thinking, you know what? It's very possible that I touched on a few areas that George did not want to admit were written by someone else, or the ideas came up from somebody else. Now, with that said, all throughout the time that um, this is making its initial rounds, and I'm giving these as Christmas gifts. I was starting out as a writer. I wrote for Starlog. Do you remember Starlog
Oh,
magazine?
I remember Starlog. I had many, many issues of that on my shelf as a kid. I don't know where they are now, but yeah, I love
Yeah.
Starlog.
And so I was working for Starlog Cinemas Fantastique. Do you remember Cinemas
Cinefantastique.
Fantastique?
Oh yes,
Yeah,
yes. Oh,
and there was
Cinefantastique.
a horror magazine called Fangoria that,
Fangoria.
yeah, yeah. So I was writing the occasional article for those different magazines and publishing, and that was sort of the beginning of my career as an actual writer. Today, I just turned my 21st manuscript into my agent, and she's reading it over now before we offer it to a publisher. And so, I have 20 books that are already in print, and this would be book number 21. So, I've come a long way since that time period.
Absolutely.
But with the introduction of Starlog to you, I was doing a lot of reading of background stuff. And I was very friendly with Dave McDonald. I don't know if you remember Dave McDonald. He used to edit Starlog. And Dave McDonald sent me a whole lot of stuff. And he says, pick through this. And, if there's something here you'd like to write an article about, we'll go ahead and publish it. And, he gave me some of the early stuff that Lucasfilm had produced. Lucas wrote a bunch of drafts, and some of them were just like stories, some of them were actual scripts. And so I was able to read through a lot of this stuff. They were called the Journal of the Wills initially, and unusual spelling on the word wills. And I had the opportunity to read through a lot of this stuff. And it was very interesting. I ended up pulling together an article that didn't go to Starlog. They didn't publish it, but it went through Sci-Fi Universe, I think was the name of the magazine. I don't
Hmm.
know if that name strikes a chord with you or not, but
It does.
yeah, so it was published in Sci-Fi Universe, and it was well, it was supposing if Lucas had stuck to his different outlines and drafts, and what would the Star Wars movies look like. And so, having read those, I had some preparation for um, writing my treatment. And I should also say that around the same time period, I wrote a story about how Darth Vader became Darth Vader.
Separate from this, you wrote a story.
Yes, yes, and
Oh, fascinating.
it
Okay.
went into one of those fanzine magazines, and basically he's all scarred up from his fight with Obi-Wan,
Hmm.
and he's taken by this mystical group of Sith lords, and he becomes Darth Vader. They put on, the whole uniform and everything else, and so that went into a fanzine, and it was read by a lot of Star Wars fans, and I got good feedback from it, and so I wanted to incorporate some of that into my treatment. And so, here's the genesis of a number of different things. But also, let me add that there was a series of stories that Isaac Asimov wrote called the Foundation stories. I loved those as a kid. And I always felt that George Lucas had borrowed very liberally from the stories. And
No doubt
so,
about it.
and in constructing my treatment, I tried to add into the treatment that whole sense that came from Asimov. Now, I had the opportunity, I met Asimov on a number of different occasions. And, when you finally do become an official SFWA member, Science Fiction Writers of America member, everybody then starts talking to you like you're one of them. And
Hmm.
so it was fun being able to talk to him on a level, author to author. And honestly, where I get some of my background about the society that is going on comes from there as well.
That actually makes a lot of sense, and you saying that I'm seeing it now. The name, Jantor of the city planet in, Lucas's prequel films, it's called Coruscant.
Yes.
But that whole notion of the bright center of the universe is this metropolis city planet that's the capital of the galaxy. That's certainly from Foundation. And yeah, and also there was something in your treatment that I thought was sort of, missing from the prequel films was this sense of the politicking, that it was more than just Palpatine at the top. It was sort of this whole society of conspiring and conniving and jockeying for position and stuff. And that's certainly something that, now that you're mentioning Foundation, I can totally see that in it. Um
Originally Palpatine was Richard Nixon, right?
yes, yes.
George was writing at the time period when Nixon, was coming out as being this huge crook and somebody behind, the Republican Party. He was, I guess, the early runner of the MAGA party before Trump came along, and so I wanted to capture Palpatine like that, and I'm not sure if that comes out or not.
No, no, I think that definitely comes out. One of the things that, from a story perspective, I understand why, this idea that the master manipulator politician who turns the Republic into an empire is also secretly the sort of Dark Lord, Wizard, Sith Lord, and he kind of combines them into one, which I think is I mean, it sort of makes sense in dramatic story terms, but it kind of does a disservice to the whole idea that to do what the emperor did or what an opportunistic politician can do, it doesn't necessitate the use of dark magic of any kind. I mean, you don't have to be some supernatural demonic force to kind of pull one over on the citizens of the galaxy or of the nation. I think that actually undercuts the message a little bit of how easy it is or how susceptible, democracies are to descending into fascism. So one thing that I liked, your Palpatine, you really get the sense of him as a politician and as someone not just power hungry because they're a Sith Lord, but also the politician side, I think, really does come through a little bit more strongly, and I appreciated that. You mentioned earlier, and this was one of the questions I had for you. You were able to read some of George Lucas's rough drafts and story treatments and stuff, because I think one of the reasons why it was so easy to believe that your treatment for Fall of the Republic was the genuine article was because you do incorporate things from Lucas's earlier drafts, like things like the Kyber crystal. You do invoke the Journal of the Wills, and the same way that I think the third draft of Star Wars, but also the novelization of Star Wars says from the adventures of Luke Skywalker, you say this is from the adventures of Obi-Wan Kenobi. And it just really gives it that feeling of authenticity. So I was going to ask you if you how you had familiarized yourself with those earlier concepts, because I know in the days before the internet, a lot harder to get your hands on that sort of stuff. But it was actually the editor of Starlog, you said, provided you with
Yes,
the
yes,
source.
and again, Dave McDonald was a terrific guy, and I think he was sort of the driving force behind this beautiful magazine. I
Mm.
know that I bought issue number one when it hit the shelf, and I had up to 100 plus issues when I finally was done with it. And Dave McDonald was a great guy. Kerry O'Quinn also. I don't know if you remember Kerry O'Quinn. He was the publisher of the magazine. It's so funny. I was at a San Diego Comic Con. This was about 2 or 3 years ago, and there's a green room that writers and other celebrities can go. And so I wanted to go in there for just about an hour to, kind of relax, have a drink, maybe nibble on, some of the food. And Terry O'Quinn was sitting there and nobody was around him. And I got the idea that nobody remembered him. And so I walked up and I said, "Can I sit here?" And he said, "Sure." And I said, "You are Terry O'Quinn, aren't you?" And he says, "Oh, yeah, yeah." And I said, "Well, you're probably not going to remember me, but I wrote for Dave McDonald, and I wrote a number of articles, in the Starlog magazine, among others. And we had this wonderful um, kind of renewal of our identities. He didn't know me, but he got a chance to know me, and it was fun. But I also wanted to add too is I have a PhD in psychology, but my MA is in English, and so when I read, I'm sorry, when I saw Star Wars originally, I thought this has all of the hallmarks of some of the great pieces of literature. Like the Three Musketeers, for example, and then of course the whole Joseph Campbell thing is there. And so, with those archetypes kind of in the back of my mind, when I sat down to do episode 3, I was trying to emulate those same kinds of stories that George obviously did. And, um, of course, it wasn't like creation. This is George's creation. I was just lucky enough to be able to play in his world because I was a fan writer, and this was never going to go out to the population. This was just
Never. I
never.
mean, banish the thought. How could that
It
ever
was
happen?
it was just to go out to about a dozen of my friends for as a Christmas gift, and this one friend, he was a dealer and he made lots of money from it. That's how it got out into the world. We had a little bit of a falling out afterwards because this is not why I gave him the gift and the other people the gift. This was just, I didn't have the money that year to buy a real gift. And so I thought I'll write a story as a gift.
Yeah, I can certainly understand, especially because it's your work, but there's also the copyright gray area of, it's a fan work, which, as I understand, is generally acceptable as long as you don't try to make money off it. So to see someone, essentially breaking the law, yet reaping large rewards from doing so, I can imagine would be somewhat galling.
I actually asked him to stop doing it, and he said, I've got a bunch here that I paid money for. Do you mind if I just sell these off?" And so I said, "Okay, okay." And then, of course, he did this very same thing to my Star Trek treatment that I wrote. And it was similar to that. That was, again, the next Christmas. So, can't trust him.
No, I guess not. Um, I mean, again, like you say, it must have felt good in a way, certainly a vote of confidence in your writing for people to really latch onto it and for it to pass muster as, the next Star Wars. I mean, for years and years, I mean, even still, it's still fooling a lot of people as an authentic document. So, I mean, I think that's testament to the quality of the writing, but it's also I think has to do with something you said about, when you saw Star Wars, you noticed a lot of familiar literary elements and sort of the sources that George Lucas was drawing upon. And you very wisely, I think, decided to draw from those very same sources in order to continue the story. And I think that was a very canny move, a canny understanding on your part of how Star Wars operated. Because I think, as is my humble opinion, I think the most successful new Star Wars, I think the most successful of them do return to the original inspirations and sort of riff on that. Whereas I think sometimes there's a mistake of making Star Wars that it's so self-referential that they're just making Star Wars about Star Wars. And I think that those are the ones that sort of fall a little flat. And I think it's because they're making the mistake of not broadening the scope of what Star Wars can do by returning to the original inspirations and sort of taking a cue from the same material that inspired George Lucas. And I think, as you just articulated, I think you very smartly went that route where you
Thank you. Yeah.
you were like, okay, what is this movie, Star Wars? What is it doing? I will do that. Not let me make something that looks like that,
Yes.
right?
Yes. But at the same time, I'm still working with the characters that George created and just trying to expand sort of outward on these. I will say that when I saw episode 6, it was after I'd written my treatment, and I was cheering because George had made Anakin Skywalker, Darth Vader, the hero of the piece.
Mm,
And so, you know what? I always thought that the first trilogy, 1, 2, and 3, should have been subtitled The Tragedy of Anakin Skywalker.
mm.
And then 4, 5, and 6 was the redemption, if you will, of Anakin Skywalker.
So, well, that's also very interesting because I think, first of all, that's something that I don't think I really realized, even though I'm seeing the date on the cover here, but I don't think I really realized until sitting down to talk with you just now that you wrote this before you saw Return of the Jedi.
Yes.
And I think it's also a testament to the writing and your understanding of how Star Wars works, that it works flawlessly with Return of the Jedi as a part of the story. And I do think it's really interesting that you appeared to end up on the same wavelength as George Lucas because I think, in terms of making Anakin Skywalker really a hero and redeeming him in Return of the Jedi, because I don't think that that was clear to a lot of people between The Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi that that's where the story had to go. I think it very easily could have gone in several other directions, but you sort of zeroed in on this idea of Anakin Skywalker slash Darth Vader as a tragic figure. That ultimately, as we know, is what George Lucas was also thinking. So I think that's also one of the reasons why I think this holds up so well, nearly, geez, or I guess, 40 years after the fact, that
Uh,
you got on the same wavelength that George Lucas was on, and only after the first two movies. So I mean, that's quite an accomplishment.
thank you very much. I'll tell you, those people who received it as a gift that Christmas read it and they said, "Oh, you know what you should do? You should try to contact George and, give him some of your ideas." Because we all thought that when Revenge of the Jedi, Return of the Jedi came out, that we would begin with the first trilogy. And again, every one of the magazines I read said he was going to do it in reverse order. So it was going to be 3, 2, and 1.
That's actually really interesting. I often think about, or I wonder about, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure that the Star Wars prequels are the first example of a true equal. If I'm not mistaken, I don't think the word prequel even existed up until this idea that there were going to be three new Star Wars movies, but they happened before the original Star Wars movies.
You can probably um, nod your head at Francis Ford Coppola
Oh, sure.
because Godfather 2
Sure.
is like half a prequel and half a sequel.
No, that's very true. And knowing the relationship that Coppola and Lucas had, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised at all if George Lucas even unconsciously was influenced by that story. But so, yeah, so I've always thought, it's a really interesting kind of creative exercise to write a story that has to work in its own right, has to be surprising and say something that, maybe you weren't aware, yet dovetail perfectly into these pre-existing stories. So I've always thought that that was an interesting creative exercise. But this idea, I actually think, is even more interesting, where you're doing the same thing, but sort of you do it three times. If you were to do episode 3, then episode 2, then episode 1, I think that would have been a very interesting way to go. And that also answers my question that I was going to ask you, why you started with episode 3 instead of with episode 1. And now it makes complete sense because you thought that the next movie was going to be episode 3. But on that note, there was a line in your script about Boba Fett is charged for the murder of the Jedi Kane Starkiller. Again, another reference to Lucas's earlier drafts, the character Kane Starkiller. But then it says in your script, the parenthetical refer to Star Wars Episode 2. So I was just wondering, having thought through a lot of what was going to happen in Star Wars Episode 3, did you come up with any ideas, or did you have a sense of what the shape of what Episode 2 and Episode 1 may have been like, sort of in continuity with the Star Wars 3 that you wrote?
Well, I actually imagined this first trilogy to be similar to again some of these classical stories that George was probably reading. And immediately it comes to the Three Musketeers. So if the Jedi are the Three Musketeers, then we have this youngster who comes among them. And D'Artagnan, he comes from a family, of respected swords people. His father was a swords master, and so I thought that Anakin was going to be not a kid in the beginning, but like a young man who comes to the Jedi and wants to be like them, but for some reason they don't take him in immediately. But he has a friendship that develops with Obi-Wan, as of course is in the story, and the character of Obi-Wan is like the eldest of the Three Musketeers, Athos, and um, the other two are there, and one or both of them gets killed off as the stories continue into Episode 3. And so I imagine it would be something along those lines. And of course, there's a woman involved, and she would have been um, something that came between D'Artagnan or Anakin, if you will, and Obi-Wan. You know, who knows?
Well, that's certainly something. I know there was a lot of speculation when the prequels were in the process of being made that Anakin was going to suspect that there was a relationship going on behind his back between Obi-Wan and Padme. And you've just connected the dots for me that I don't believe I never made the Three Musketeers connection before. So what you're saying is that you envisioned Kane Starkiller as one of that Three Musketeers sort
Yes,
of triumvirate who would have met his end the
exactly,
movie before. And episode see, I really
exactly.
I like that. I think that's very cool. What you just described is very much in line with how these events are described to the extent that they are in dialogue in the original trilogy of films. And I think some fans would argue, and I know some fans would argue, that the prequel movies that George Lucas made don't always necessarily agree with what was laid out in the original films. I mean,
Yeah,
that your mileage may vary on that, but that's certainly a valid, I think, point of view. I think, any number of reasons for that. The proximity between, how far removed he was from having made the originals when he made the prequel films, that could have something to do with it. But then just also, I mean, as a writer yourself, I think, things evolve and sort of change in your mind. And what interests you changes and evolves. I mean, it's a product of who you are as a writer when you're writing it. So I don't know that I would call any of these deviations necessarily mistakes, because I think that that does a disservice to what the artist is actually doing and what the process of creating something actually is. But that said, another reason I think your treatment still holds up is because it does dovetail very nicely with the things that were said and described in the original films. And ironically, I think as fans of a work, I think perhaps we have even more reverence for what is said in those movies than the creator of them. And I guess I'm not really crescendoing to a point here, but I guess I'll just sort of ask you, as a writer, do you sometimes see something someone else has written or created or a movie someone has made and say, not what I would have done, though I see where you're coming from and I respect that that's what it is?
yes, exactly. And in fact, but the biggest complaint that I have heard from fans, and it's a complaint that I share also for episodes 1, 2, and 3, is that there's a lot of stuff in there that um, actually takes away from the fun of the original trilogy. And I thought if Lucas had done away with a lot of the political stuff that's in there, it would have been a lot more fun. I mean, think about it. Do we have to know about what's going on in France during that period of the Three Musketeers? Not really. We can make a couple of references and then let it go. And I initially thought that that's how Lucas was going to go. He was going to have this sort of quasi, the Jedi were going to be like the Musketeers. They weren't going to be soldiers. They weren't going to be law enforcement people. But they were going to have a point in the government somehow. And it was going to be, these guys are going out and they're going to have a fun adventure. And that's how I imagined the first three films as being. And then, of course, we've got this fun adventure going on in episode one. And then things get to be a little bit more serious by episode two. And then, of course, all hell breaks loose in episode three as what I've written. So I imagine the original trilogy to be much more fun than it turned out to be. Um,
Yeah. Well, it is interesting, in your treatment for Fall of the Republic, the politics is there, but just the way that it's handled, it just feels like a natural outgrowth of the world and of the story. It doesn't feel like a digression, I suppose.
I mean, did we need to know all that stuff about the trade guilds?
Yeah, well, um, it's funny. So we just recorded our episode on the Phantom Menace. So with the podcast, we're entering the the beginning of our prequel themed coverage.
Mhm.
Um, and we just had a long conversation about the Phantom Menace, and I think what we landed on was it's not necessarily that it was out of place. It just needed a little more refinement for it to do what I think the aim was. And just unfortunately, I do think it's a little clunky. And the reason for why it's there, I don't think fully comes across in the final product.
Yeah, I agree with you.
It's so fascinating. Star Wars is one of these things where it really is a modern fairy tale. It's a contemporary mythology. It's the story that we all know and we all sort of have in common. And I love talking about it and imagining what ifs and talking it over and over. Obviously, I have a Star Wars podcast, so it's
Right.
clearly something that I have an endless reservoir of enthusiasm for. And what's so fascinating too is that it's almost like George Lucas was so much more successful in creating what he did for his own good, because what happened was you have 2 decades, or not even in your case, but like almost 2 decades of the entire world trying to come up with their own version of what these new movies are gonna be like. And there's no way, I mean, I don't care who you are, there's no way that what you come up with is going to satisfy the legions of fans around the world who have been imagining the possibilities and the what ifs and the everything for years and years and years. So, you almost have to feel bad for the guy, but though I don't know that I go that far. But it's certainly a creative challenge, and I have to imagine trying to do that must, how do you create the situation so that you're free to be creative without feeling the weight and the pressure of the expectations? I mean, as a
Yes.
writer
Yeah.
yourself, I mean, do you have some thoughts on that?
I do. I write sci-fi and mystery right now, and I have a series of mystery novels that has a central character. And I always wanted to write a James Bond story. It's sort of like Steven Spielberg and George Lucas being on that beach talking about Indiana Jones. Well, I wanted to
Mhm.
write a James Bond story where it wasn't a male James Bond, a male spy. I wanted to write a female spy. And
Mm.
when I started working on this, I ended up realizing I don't want her to be a spy at all. She's going to become a detective and she's going to be in homicide. And, suddenly my story, created itself more or less. And this 21st book that I was telling you about, I'm with a new publisher now, and they're publishing all my mystery stories. And the one thing that the publisher said to me was, we don't have an origin story for your detective. And I thought, oh, okay,
Oh.
let me write the origin story. And so that's what I've written. Is that's book 21 in my collection of books, and it starts 20 years earlier, and then comes up to date.
So
And
you've
so
written you've gone through the same exercise. You have written
exactly,
a prequel to your own universe. Interesting.
exactly. And so I was leading up to imagine for a moment you're sitting down to watch episode one. Okay. Now, do you remember how much fun Star Wars A New Hope was? I mean, to me, it was all of the Saturday morning cartoons and serials that I would watch. And so I imagined that episode one would be like, again, I hate to keep going back to the Three Musketeers, but that's a story I absolutely adore. And can you imagine three Jedi's showing up? Okay, Kane Starkiller being one, Obi-Wan Kenobi, and then there's another one. And they're saying, "Oh, for one, one for all, oh for one." I mean, and they have to go chasing out to fight bad guys with their lightsabers. I mean, and it doesn't matter that it's a trade guild or whatever. It's just they've got to do this, you know. And how much fun it would have been to then have Anakin as a young man, you know, he's a teenager coming in and, oh, I'm going to join you guys, even though I don't know everything, you know. And that's how I imagined episode one would go. And
Mm.
eventually, you know, he would be introduced to you know, to the whole order of the Musketeers, and you know, there would be a beautiful woman involved, and you know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And but again, I kept thinking this whole notion they're pulling their lightsabers out, and one of them says, "One for all and all for one," and then they go running off to do whatever they're going to do. That's how I wanted to see episode one start.
Mm.
And it's very heavy the way that episode one is right now. It doesn't have the light, fun touches that I would have liked.
Well, you know
So,
what's interesting about that? Because I just had a very long conversation about this very subject of episode one.
mhm,
One of the things that we were talking about was how the tone of episode one varies wildly. Like there's the very heavy, as you say, political stuff, and that's right alongside, very cartoonish, some might say juvenile humor. And it sort of moves from one extreme in tone to another, versus something like what you're describing, I think, is light but not unserious,
yeah,
right?
yes,
Where I think there's an attempt, I think, in episode one, The Phantom Menace, the film, to introduce some levity through things like the character of Jar Jar, through the, some of the elements of it that seem overtly designed for children. Whereas I think, another way to go, and I'd be very curious what George Lucas's thought process was. It's just one of those things that, we'll just never know, but I there is another alternative, which is to do as you say. It's not necessarily to have to lighten the heavy stuff with the juvenile stuff, but there's like a sort of a middle ground of fun action adventure the whole way through, without, avoiding any of the thornier or weightier things. I mean, your Fall of the Republic treatment, it sounds like in what you're describing, it would be sort of the darkest that it ever gets.
yes,
And I think the tone that you create, the sense that you create in this, it is very dark, but it still feels within the realm of what Star Wars can do and what it feels like.
mhm,
Um, yeah, again, I mean, I know I keep saying this, but I think that just in talking to you and having recently reread the Fall of the Republic script, I now have a much better, I think, understanding of why it has persisted for so long as, this sort of curio or an object of fascination with Star Wars fans. It's because there is something about it that feels very genuine. It feels like a very plausible version of what Star Wars Episode 3 may very well have been like in some other alternate universe.
Let me go on to say, there are a couple things in that darker portion of my story there that you may not have picked up, but I actually kill off Obi-Wan Kenobi in that treatment. You will see that he's going through an exploding star.
Oh,
He
that's interesting.
he's not supposed to have survived. And so when I first saw Star Wars: A New Hope, I imagined that Obi-Wan Kenobi was a Force ghost, even though, long before we came up with the idea of Force ghost, I thought he was, not alive. And then when Darth Vader slices him in half, there's no body that's there.
Right, because he was never there. He was a
Yeah,
Force ghost the whole time. That's fascinating. You're right. I didn't pick up on that, but I'm looking at what you wrote again, the end. Yeah, so because I think the reason that that didn't land with me is because we all assume that, I mean, or I guess not we all, but I assumed that he stays alive because he shows up in the next movie, right?
yeah, yeah, of course.
But now that you're saying this, yeah, he flies through the core of the exploding star. You do see him again in your sort of closing
Yeah, the epilogue.
montage here,
Yeah,
but that doesn't necessarily mean that he's in corporeal form.
yeah.
That's very interesting.
And,
I didn't pick up on that.
what about, my portrayal of Yoda, for that matter?
I appreciated your portrayal of Yoda. I am of the opinion in the Star Wars prequel films that we got, I'm one of those who didn't love that he fought with a lightsaber. And I thought that your portrayal of Yoda, I think, preserved a lot of the mystique of the character that I think in the prequel films there's I don't know if this is going to make any sense. There's like a piece of acting advice where it's something along the lines of never show them your top because there's nowhere else to go because they've seen it. And I kind of feel that way with Yoda, that he would seem much more powerful if we never actually saw him with a lightsaber and see what he could do. It would be much more powerful the less we see of him. So I actually really appreciated the way that you handle Yoda. And I'm actually just now realizing again, because I only just in this conversation realized that you had only seen The Empire Strikes Back when you wrote it. You hadn't seen Return of the Jedi yet.
Yes, yeah.
So your depiction of Yoda is based solely on that one film, which again it feels so in line with the rest of the trilogy. It's really a testament to how well you were able to understand the character and what it was supposed to feel like.
Well, I'll tell you something else, Josh. My grandmother, is the person responsible for having raised me and given me the values and morals that I have. And, I saw The Empire Strikes Back, and then she died over the 4th of July holiday. And
Mm,
then I saw it again just after that. And, I've seen The Empire Strikes Back more in a theater than I've ever seen it on television. And when I'm watching the film after her death, I'm seeing in the character of Yoda my grandmother. And I am imagining, this powerful individual, who doesn't have to use a lightsaber or anything else to control the force. In fact, we see Emperor Palpatine, he's able to shoot those lightning bolts out of his hands and whatever else. I imagine Yoda being like that as well. He doesn't resort to a lightsaber. Although we certainly have a couple of hints and clues of that, because in The Empire Strikes Back, he takes a liking to Luke's little flashlight that he has, which kind
right.
of looks like a lightsaber.
Yeah.
But I just imagine a character who is beyond, lightsabers. He has
Yeah.
so much more powerful than that. In fact, I think the prequel trilogy misuses Yoda. I would have
Well,
much preferred him more like where I am in my story than, like how he was used.
Well, that actually reminds me of something that I wanted to touch on. Like the way that the Jedi are depicted in the prequel films, they're depicted as essentially, very cozy with the government. I mean, their Jedi temple is within sight of the Senate chamber, and you
Mhm.
very much get the sense that they have a very close relationship with the Senate itself. I mean, certainly the executive in the first movie, the chancellor has sent them on this mission. It is kind of interesting because I think the way that I had imagined it was something more along the lines of what you're describing, where there's sort of an organization. It's not a part of the government, but they're sort of their own thing. It's a belief system, it's a way of life, and they come and they go, and they intersect with galactic affairs, obviously, at certain points, but they're not part of the hierarchy, if you will. Like they're sort of beside it.
Yes, absolutely.
And Yoda, I don't know, there's something very weird to me, the idea of Yoda sort of literally sitting on top of this ivory tower,
Mhm.
in a circle of these, I don't know, bureaucratic monks.
Yes.
You kind of want him to be above that.
Yes, yes.
I mean, or beside it. This whole idea that Yoda is kind of off doing his own thing, and Obi-Wan has to seek him out for advice,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
Like in your script. That's more in line with how I imagined Yoda, the position he would have in the galaxy. It's sort of he's not at the top of the food chain. He doesn't have to be. He's Yoda,
Yeah.
right? It's
Yeah,
sort
yeah,
of
yeah.
I am very curious why George Lucas went the route of, really formalizing the Jedi Order, making them a real rigid institution with like a ruling body and a very close relationship with the government. I think there are a lot of interesting ideas in there. It's just, I mean, again, there's what was laid out in the original trilogy and what it led one to imagine the Jedi were like, and then there's what he decided to do, he being George Lucas. And again, there's nothing wrong with what he did. He can do whatever he wants. It's just, I think how you envisioned Yoda and the role of the Jedi felt, more like what was being described in the original trilogy. And again, it's only a handful of lines in the original trilogy where they even, mention the Jedi or anything that happened before the movies. So, maybe we were all wrong. I don't, I don't know.
Well
Um,
well, again, if I could go back to, the Three Musketeers, um, they're not an order, if you will. They're not police,
right.
they're this group, they're the captain, there's a captain there that, kinda oversees them, Treville is his name,
Hmm.
and, they're sort of the king's men, if you will, but, you've got a very weak king. And the Pope is really the strong force there. So, the Pope is like Palpatine, really, if you think about it.
Right.
And the Pope actually has his own men. So the Cardinal has his own guard. And they're always at odds with the, if you will, the Jedi or the Three Musketeers. So that's more how I had imagined how the Sith would be with the Jedi and so on. I mean, they add all of this mystery and stuff behind the Sith that I don't think needed to be there at all. But okay, it's there.
No, I mean, just even in this conversation, there's a version of the Jedi where, someone who learns how to wield the Force, which is this like really far out sort of idea. Like you could imagine to be a Jedi is like a very countercultural thing. It's like it's still something that your average galactic citizen really has trouble wrapping their mind around. It's like, wait, you can, levitate objects and you can mind trick people. It's sort of there's a version of it where they are sort of on the outside looking in,
Hmm.
and they get involved when, either there's a moral imperative or there's some sort of a situation, but yet they sort of stay on the outside and kind of do their own thing. And then it's interesting because in that scenario, when you have Obi-Wan talking to Luke in Star Wars, and you have the other voice of his Uncle Owen saying, that wizard's just a crazy old man. You don't want to listen to him. He's actually not wrong.
Oh, that's right. That's right.
Yeah.
think
Uh,
about George Lucas. He's coming out of the
the
60s.
60s, exactly, right.
And who are these Jedi guys? They're hippies, if you will.
Yeah, exactly,
And
exactly, and
so
then yeah. No, yeah. So I think you're actually articulating something that I haven't been able to articulate myself, but this idea that the Jedi, to my mind, there's something wrong about the Jedi being so involved in the mainstream order of things,
yes,
being a part of the status quo and sort of sitting on top. There's something about that that just feels at odds with how they are spoken about and how, how we understand their beliefs. I mean, frankly.
sure, sure. Could I suggest something to you? This was something that I always liked from the Superman films.
Mm.
When Jor-El talks to Kal-El for the first time, he says, you're not supposed to go in and change anything. Okay, let your actions move others. And so I always like that speech that father gives to son there. And I imagine the Jedi as being like that. They were not supposed to go in and be an army, if you will. They're supposed to inspire others to action.
No, that's a very good point. And I think this is an idea that's present in the films as they exist, though it still doesn't contradict anything that we're saying. With this whole idea of General Kenobi, years ago, you served my father in the Clone Wars.
Hmm.
Like, there is this idea that, when the Jedi have to become generals, things have gotten really, really bad,
Yes, yes.
right? So I think it sort of speaks to the dire state of affairs in the galaxy that the Jedi, they do have to become the army because things are so desperate.
Hmm. 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 And Obi-Wan, when I was thinking about the character, obviously we know him as Ben. Okay, so he's kind of like the common man, if you will, the man in the gray flannel suit. Okay, everybody wears a gray flannel suit. All right, but initially when I was looking at his name, I was thinking not Juan Wan. I was thinking one One. And so, I was mistaken myself. I was thinking that Obi-Wan was maybe a clone of the original Obi, whoever that was. And
Mm.
so, I don't have that in my treatment, but that was something that I was thinking about when I was writing my treatment.
Do you want to know what is so fascinating to me? We also had this discussion that the line "you fought in the Clone Wars" is so evocative of so much more than I would argue you could even really satisfyingly depict in a film. One wonders if maybe you lose something when you actually commit these stories to film. It's sort of a perverse joke, and it sort of always was from the original Star Wars. I know on original release it never said episode 4, though I think he had wanted to have an episode number, but it was decided that it would be too confusing and like to just dispense with all that because this movie's already is already wacky enough.
Hmm.
But this idea that it's implicit in the nature of the movie as seeming like it's part of a Saturday morning serial. And also with the episode number starting at 4, this idea that something happened before, but we're never going to tell you what it is. Because that's sort of not the point of the exercise. The point of the exercise is to fire your imagination, make you wonder what it was that happened. It's for you to come up with the story of what happened before. And in that sense, I think that Star Wars 3 Fall of the Republic by John L. Flynn is the most authentic Star Wars you can get.
Thank you, thank you. That's very nice of you to say that. One of the master strokes in Steven Spielberg's Jaws is you don't see the shark that much, mostly because the shark didn't work. Okay.
Right.
So I think working off what you just said, um, I think it's better that we don't see the Clone Wars. Okay. And in fact, the Clone Wars, I was bored to death by, what they produced. in the name of the Clone Wars. I'd rather not have had all of that and had that left more to my imagination, because my imagination's going to fill in blanks that, are going to be 10 times better than what was ever come up with on the screen. Are you on the same page with me, maybe?
No, yeah, it's very true. George Lucas, he often says in interviews that he had to wait so long to make the prequel trilogy because the technology wasn't there to
Hmm.
realize his vision. And I think for him that is true, but I think that there's something to be said for the restrictions of not being able to show everything because it forces you to leave more to the imagination, to be more evocative with what
Hmm.
is not shown, what is not said.
Exactly. Exactly.
Um, and one of the interesting things to me about, the prequel trilogy is like they're constantly, talking about the nature of the Force, and you have this introduction of the midichlorians,
Yes.
this sort of, biological explanation for the Force. And there are ways that I can, rationalize that to sort of make it fit within my conception of what Star Wars is. But at the end of the day, everything you need to know about Star Wars, the backstory, and the Force is still all said in that first movie.
Yes.
Like the way that they talk about the Clone Wars, like it's all contained in that short conversation. It's just all, I mean, that's all you need to know about it.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
And again, there's a universe where the prequel films are never made, and Star Wars is always starting in media res, I think is the term,
Yes.
where the movie is demanding of you, the viewer, the audience, to imagine, come up with what happened in one, two, and three. I think that there's something sort of lovely and charming about
I love that.
about
I
that.
love that. I agree with that too.
Yeah, but that's not the world that we live in. But I mean, just life.
And I will say that Lawrence Kasdan, one of my favorite films is Raiders of the Lost Ark. Lawrence Kasdan is such a genius, and he he actually builds that, um, the world building for Star Wars right there in the second film. And a lot of what Lucas talks about, Lawrence Kasdan actually imagines for us on the screen. And I will say that that's some of the best writing that I have ever seen. Again, I don't mean to dismiss A New Hope. That's a work of genius all in unto itself. But when it comes to The Empire Strikes Back, I think that's the stronger of the two films. If you ask me that, just as I would say that The Godfather Part Two is the stronger of the three films that are there. And Lawrence Kasdan, I don't think he's gotten all of the credit that he really deserves for all of that world building that he did there. And he does a good job for Lucas. I mean, Lucas gets credit for the story, but Lawrence Kasdan is really the one who imagines all of that stuff there. And it's a terrific film, and I love the fact that the second film, um, actually, film number five, ends on that cliffhanger the way that it does.
Mm. No,
So,
yeah, there's so many things about The Empire Strikes Back that are extraordinary. I think it's the best Star Wars movie for so many reasons, and it's also, in my humble opinion, sort of along the lines of what you're saying. Had The Empire Strikes Back not been as fantastic as it was, I don't think Star Wars would have gone on to spawn so many other films and stories and still be something that we're talking about the way that we are now.
mhm,
I think it, may have been the original film and then, like, a couple of follow-up films that never
yeah,
quite captured the same magic.
yeah,
Um, and we would all be talking about what a brilliant film the original Star Wars is, and we still are. But The Empire Strikes Back, I think, really is what made Star Wars into the timeless franchise, if you want to use that word,
oh
that
yeah.
it is now. It took what was laid out in the original Star Wars and it showed everybody what you could do in this universe.
Mhm. And I must tell you that after having seen The Empire Strikes Back, of course, I'm like every other Star Wars fan out there. I couldn't wait for the third one. to come
Of
out. And
course.
of course, it was in the light of having just seen The Empire Strikes Back that I began writing my treatment.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's one of the themes that is emerging as I do this podcast is the degree to which Star Wars really inspires creativity in people. So before we wrap up here, I do want to highlight some of your other work. I know that you've written both fiction and nonfiction, and I dipped my toe. I read The Jovian Dilemma, and I
Yeah.
enjoyed it very much. So I'm just wondering, for someone who wants to familiarize themselves with your work, what would you recommend somebody read if they're a sci-fi fan, if they're a Star Wars fan? What is something you would hand them and say, start there?
Well, I think the Jovian Dilemma is, I'm glad you mentioned that. When I sat down to write that, I wrote that as a film treatment first, which is so funny. And I've since produced a screenplay before I produced the novel itself, and so it is a story that has nothing to do with the Star Wars universe at all. It takes place really in our own universe. I wanted to write a hardcore science fiction story, and the Star Wars stuff, that it's more fantasy than hardcore. I also wanted to imagine an alien species, not at all like the ones that we see in Star Wars, but an alien species based upon the environment that they're living in. And so if you notice, the story is about a space station that is orbiting Jupiter, and Jupiter, it's mostly gas, and these creatures live in that gaseous environment. And they've been living there for billions of years. And, they've not evolved to humans at all. In fact, the story is more than anything else a first contact story between us and them. But, it's not like they speak colloquial English like they do in the Star Wars films. They have to figure out how do you end up speaking with an alien species, particularly one that is just, there's no resemblance whatsoever to human beings at all. That was the kind of story that I set out to write. And it evolved. It started as a short story, then it went to screen treatment, then a screenplay, and then finally the novel. And my agent tried to sell the screen treatment, and the strength treatment ended up winning a prize in a film competition for screenplays. And I was very happy about that, but we couldn't get a production company interested in it because obviously, when you're writing screen treatments or screenplays, you want to see this made into a movie. And so, and then I turned to writing my mystery novels, and my mystery novels are all about this one character. It's a female character, unusual for a male writing a female character, but she is a homicide detective, and she gets, into all sorts of things that are above her pay grade, as it were. And if you're interested, my bestseller of that is Murder on Air Force One. And so if you want to start reading John Flynn works, what's interesting about that is I also wrote that as a screenplay, and I've had that option, but it's sat there throughout the pandemic, and who knows if it'll ever get made into a film. But we as writers, we just got to keep writing because that's in our blood, so to speak. And so,
Exactly. By the way, for anyone who wants to check out either of the books that Dr. Flynn has just mentioned, you can go to his website, John L. Flynn, Flynn with a Y.com. I'm also interested in some of your nonfiction. As you said earlier, you wrote a lot of articles for Starlog and other sci-fi publications, but you've written some volumes on the production of certain sci-fi films. If you could mention some of the
oh, happy
um,
to.
things that you've worked on.
Happy to. I will say that my most recent book, so I just turned the manuscript into my agent. That will become book 21. But my book before that was about Angelique Pettyjohn. Do you know who Angelique Pettyjohn is?
from the Gamesters of Triskelion.
Yes, yes, that's a favorite episode of mine. I actually met this woman at a Star Trek convention, and she needed some serious help. She had her stuff spread over a table. She needed change. Oh my goodness! And from that first day, we just became fast friends. And she died in 1992. She had cervical cancer, and on her deathbed, after we had been together for the last 10 years of her life, on her deathbed, she says, John, you know me um, better than anyone. Um, and I've seen your writing in the different magazines. She says, would you tell my story someday? And it took me 28 years to research your story. Of course, I'm not doing that all at once. I'm doing that in between other writings that I'm doing. But she lived an incredible life. She was in 40 movies. She did 15 different TV series, and she had a career as a showgirl in Las Vegas as well. She was quite an extraordinary woman, and I was very, very proud to have gotten to know her and to been. I was her confidant, I guess, if you will. And what's interesting about Angelique Pettyjohn is she gave birth to Elvis Jr. She and Elvis Presley hooked up, and she had Elvis Jr. She gave him up for adoption, but he's now in his 50s. He's a performer. In fact, he's won, I think, 3 or 4 platinum albums from his singing.
Oh, wow.
And I'm actually going to a concert of his in Port Charlotte, Florida, in a couple of days. And he asked me to come and sell copies of the book because his story is also told in that book. He wrote the forward to the book, and then toward the end of the book, there's more about him as a performer and how he came into being. So,
So is that book available now or is it forthcoming?
oh no, it's out there. You can buy it on Amazon.com. In fact, all 20 of my books are on Amazon.com. That one's called, I had originally called it The Star Trek Siren, but Paramount wouldn't let me use the word Star Trek in my title. So it ended up becoming the Sci Fi Siren.
I think the Sci-Fi Siren still works. I mean, I feel badly. You said that she was in 40 movies and 15 TV series and all these things. And, you mentioned her name, and I'm thinking of this one episode of Star Trek, when in reality, she, from what I know of her, she did so much more than that. So I think that is definitely next up on my reading list. I'm very excited to dive in.
Were you ever a fan of Get Smart?
Yes, I was. I actually recently started watching it again for the first time since I don't know, since the 1990s, when it was on TV all the time. She
Do,
was on Get Smart?
yeah, do you remember the character Charlie Watkins?
Was that Angelique Pettyjohn?
Yeah, yeah. So the character
Oh.
of Charlie Watkins is a man, and it's literally a man, and he's a master of disguise. And so his disguise is this beautiful, gorgeous woman,
Oh, that's funny. That
and
is
that's
really funny.
Angelique Pettyjohn. And it's funny, she got more mail than Maxwell Smart's. Well, her name is 99, I think,
Yeah,
on the show.
yeah.
And so 99 was not happy with the fact that Angelique got so much more mail than her. And she wasn't really a regular on the show. She did like 4 or 5 episodes. And so 99 says, you've got to cut her part. She can't
Yeah.
get more mail than me. But she was on Batman and just so many other TV shows. She even was on Hill Street Blues. She played a prostitute on Hill Street Blues. So, she had quite a career. And what's interesting, while she was doing the autographing at the Star Trek conventions, and you've been to Star Trek conventions, so you know about how they do all that autographing stuff. She she had these producers and writers coming up to her and saying, I saw you on Star Trek and I always loved you on Star Trek. And she would say, well, thank you very much. And then they would say, what are you doing now? and she would say, "Well, I'm doing this autographing and whatever," and they would offer her parts in their movies. Now it's small, she had a bunch of tiny roles, but I mean, she had like a renaissance in the '80s by doing all these small roles.
Oh, from her Star Trek notoriety. So
Yes,
people would see
exactly.
her and then give her. Oh no, yeah, that's lovely. Yeah, that just goes to show how work begets work, and you never know what the thing is that is uh going to become, your calling card. What's going to open that next door. I think that's kind of the nature of any creative industry or the entertainment industry. You just gotta, as you said, you keep plugging away because you never know what the thing is going to be, the thing that resonates for whatever reason.
Now, early on in my career, I did, of course, the Star Wars piece, The Fall of the Republic, and it continues to haunt me, but not in a bad way. I'm always happy to talk about it with fans, and somebody will come racing up and say, "Will you sign this for me?" And I'm thinking, "Well, sure, I never got paid for it, but I'll sign it for you."
No, that's really lovely. I was going to close by asking you how it feels to have written yourself into the Star Wars story, but that seems as good an answer as any.
I got to tell you, I love the Star Wars films. I've seen them so many times, and of course the middle trilogy. The other ones are okay, but I love that middle trilogy. And if I go to my grave, and the best thing that they can say about me is I wrote Fall of the Republic. Well, I guess that's not a bad thing, is it?
Absolutely not. Definitely not. Well, Dr. Flynn, I really do want to thank you very much for being so gracious with your time and for taking the time to chat with me about this. It was really a lot of fun. I'm really glad I was able to find you and that you're as lovely to talk to as I hoped.
Well, I had a lot of fun too. Thank you very much.
And again, once again, anything you want to know about Dr. John L. Flynn and his work can be found by visiting his website, johnlflynn.com. Again, that's Flynn with a Y. Transcripts of this episode and all of our other episodes are available at trashcompod.com, and we are Trashcompod across all social media, and we will see you on the next one.